Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I'm Jack Eit. On today's show, Supergut, healing our gut microbiomes for inner and outer health. Host Carrie Kim will be interviewing Dr. William Davis, cardiologist and author of the books Wheat Belly, Undoctored, and Supergut. We had Bill on the show last year, and I recommend you check out the podcast on our archives as part one to this interview. Dr. William Davis is a cardiologist and New York Times #1 best-selling author of the Wheat Belly book series. He is medical director and founder of the Infinite Health program, including the Infinite Health Inner Circle. He is chief medical officer and co-founder of Realize Therapeutics Corporation, that is developing innovative solutions for the disrupted human microbiome, and author of the book Supergut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, today we are grateful to have cardiologist Dr. William Davis, best-selling author of the Wheat Belly book series, and now Supergut, a 4-week plan to reprogram your microbiome, restore health, and lose weight, back on the show. Do check out our prior episode with Dr. Davis, where we discuss the benefits of eliminating modern industrial wheat from our diets. That is an essential show. And today we'll be doing a deep dive into his latest book, Supergut, and how to restore our gut microbiomes for the benefit of our inner and outer health. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their enduring leadership and legacy as our show comes to you from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. And we invite and encourage all listeners to engage, align, and act on behalf of the Native nations where you live, to help preserve and ensure their legacy for generations to come. May we act in solidarity with the original Indigenous peoples, and they are claimed by the places we may now live, and it is our dual responsibility to take care of this planet. The gut microbiome of many, if not most, modern people is highly compromised and has been devastated by highly processed diets, pesticides, and overuse of antibiotics, to name a few. This has destroyed countless beneficial bacteria required for optimal health. The impacts are many upon our mental health, moods, weight, and behaviors. The ancient bacteria that has kept our digestion highly functional have been dying and replaced by harmful microbes that negatively impact our physical and mental well-being. Supergut, the book by Dr. William Davis, draws on cutting-edge research to connect the dots between gut health and modern ailments, including SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, a silent and profound epidemic affecting over half of the population, at least 100 to 150 million people, or 1 out of 3 people. Entire species of microbes have disappeared, creating numerous health conditions that were uncommon even 50 to 100 years ago. Digestive disorders, Parkinson's, autism, ADD, ADHD, and neurodegenerative conditions such as dementia and Alzheimer's are more prevalent than ever before, which is why it's vital for us to discuss how to eliminate bad bacteria and restore good bacteria, how to reprogram our gut microbiomes. By addressing the root cause of gut flora disruption, we can improve health, inner and outer. And in this episode, Dr. Davis will reveal how to restore our microbiomes as the key to lasting inner and outer health. Welcome back, Bill. We are thrilled to have you back.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Glad to be back.
There's so much to discuss. I felt like last time we had to give a little short shrift to Supergut because we did such an extensive discussion on wheat and its elimination from our diets. But in any case, you are involved in so many fronts on health, And I'm just wondering, what is the latest and greatest for you in this evolutionary microbiome work?
As you pointed out, there is this silent epidemic going on. So we're all no strangers to pandemics and epidemics, right?
Mm.
COVID, AIDS,
Mhm,
diabetes. But there's one that's almost nobody's talking about. There are some who are, but many are not. And that is precisely what you pointed out. SIBO, small
mhm,
intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that I myself, Carrie, thought
mhm,
was rare
mm,
until a consumer device came out a few years ago. It's called the AIR device,
mhm,
AIRE, and it
mhm,
talks to your smartphone. It's essentially a mapping device to tell you where microbes are living in the 30
mhm,
feet of your gastrointestinal tract. And I had people test their hydrogen gas.
mhm,
That's what it measures.
mhm,
Lo and behold, it's everywhere. And I want to know why. Why is it everywhere? Well, it
mhm,
became clear that, as you point out, all the things we've been exposed to, excessive antibiotics, glyphosate, and
mhm,
herbicide, other
mhm,
herbicides and pesticides, stomach acid blocking drugs,
mhm,
nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, preservatives that
mhm,
are antimicrobial in food and in us,
mhm,
emulsifying agents that disrupt the mucus barrier that protects us. A long list of factors have disrupted the gastrointestinal microbiome.
mhm,
What that did was, as you pointed out, killed off hundreds of beneficial species, and that allowed fecal microbes. Microbes are supposed to stay in your colon, and you pass them out in the toilet
mhm,
to proliferate, to over proliferate, and then even more remarkably, ascend into the 24 feet of small intestine. Well, the small intestine is not prepared for that. It's ill equipped because the small intestine is where you're supposed to absorb nutrients
mhm,
like amino acids and vitamins and minerals. And it's not well protected, it has a thin
mhm,
single layer mucus barrier, unlike the two-layer
mhm.
mucus barrier of the colon. The colon is perfectly suited to fecal microbes, not the small
Right.
intestine.
Mhm,
So we have trillions of fecal species living in the 24 feet of small intestine. They
mhm.
don't live for a few hours. When they
Right.
die, they release their toxic compound, but one is especially called endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide endotoxin.
Mhm,
And that enters the bloodstream. That's called endotoxemia. The
mhm.
crazy thing about that is when this happens, you don't necessarily have to have gastrointestinal symptoms. You could have symptoms of irritable
Right.
bowel syndrome or ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, or
Mhm,
it could be experienced as anxiety
mhm,
or depression or
mhm,
cognitive impairment or Parkinson's disease, or it could be
mhm,
experienced in your muscles as fibromyalgia or joints as rheumatoid arthritis, or in your thyroid as Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or in
mhm,
your heart as atrial fibrillation or coronary disease. In other words, we've got to reconsider virtually all modern diseases now as having either their origin or at
mhm,
least made worse by this process of endotoxemia that got its start as SIBO in your small intestine.
mhm. Well, we are going to speak a lot more about SIBO, and I don't know if you have the air device there with you. Maybe not.
No, I'm actually on my laptop in the office.
Ah, okay,
I
okay.
usually do. It's at my desk
Yeah,
at home.
yeah. The air device is a device that Dr. Davis is talking about that measures the hydrogen gas, right? Could you maybe explain a little bit about the device and how that actually works as a mapping device to help
So it wasn't
understand?
originally intended to be a mapping device. I actually called the inventor, Dr. Angus Short, who
Hmm.
invented it in Dublin, Ireland. He's a
Hmm.
PhD engineer, and he
Hmm.
saw his wife struggling with her irritable bowel syndrome, her
Right.
IBS, and
Uh-huh.
was told to go on a low FODMAPs diet, which, by the way, is a very bad idea.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, so she's on a low FODMAPs diet, low fiber, low sugar diet, and
Hmm.
that reduces the bloating and diarrhea of irritable bowel syndrome. But he saw that she got tripped up frequently. And so
Hmm.
he made this device. You could do this in a lab too, but no one wants to go to a lab every time you make a mistake in diet. So he
Hmm.
made this very nice consumer device, and you blow into it, and it talks to your smartphone on a scale of 0 to 10, how much hydrogen gas you're producing.
Hmm.
Because humans can't produce hydrogen gas, but microbes do. But
Right.
it depends on you ingest something that microbes will metabolize to hydrogen gas.
Okay.
And it should not, and this is normal in the colon. So if
Right.
I ingest something, it should take a minimum of 90 minutes to get through the 24 feet of small intestine
Okay.
and
Hmm.
then get normal production of hydrogen gas. So hydrogen
Hmm.
gas produced, say, at 2 hours, that's normal.
Got
But if
it.
we take something, we use inulin, the
Hmm.
fiber inulin,
Hmm.
and let's say my measurement goes from something low, 0 to 10, let's say 1.2, and goes to 9.8. in 30 minutes after consuming the inulin.
Right.
That tells us the microbes are living high, like in the stomach or duodenum or jejunum. So it's
Mm-hmm.
a mapping device.
Right.
Um,
One
and
way to
I
assess.
was shocked by it was the uncommon person who tested negative. Now you
Mm-hmm.
might say, well, maybe the device is flawed, maybe the concept is flawed, but I also saw this. People would address the SIBO, correct it,
Mm-hmm.
which by the way is fairly easy, but
Mm-hmm.
not doing it the conventional way.
Right.
They correct the SIBO and they say, you know what? My panic, my suicidal thoughts are now gone. My
Mm-hmm.
weight loss plateau finally broke and I lost 35 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
My hemoglobin A1C was terrible at the start. It was 11.7%. I was a type 2 diabetic. I did your basic program. It went down to 6.1, but not ideal, which is in the 4 range, less than 5.0%.
Okay.
They correct their SIBO, it drops to 4.8%. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
we saw all the residual problems go away, finally
Mm-hmm.
go away completely. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've seen spectacular results just by correcting the SIBO.
Now, did most people, I know in the Supergut book, it talks about a 4-week plan, but I know, it's obviously going to have variability because everyone is unique. But would you say it is actually realistic for the majority of people to transform that in just 4 weeks by doing
They'll get a
specific?
start. As you know, Karen, there's a lot of sick people out there, a
Mhm.
lot of sick people.
With multiple conditions, a lot of
That's right.
comorbidities. Mm-hmm.
Because their doctors aren't doing their job.
Mm-hmm.
They're too busy charging money to dispense pharmaceuticals and procedures, but
Right.
don't get involved, nor are they very, I'm generalizing, of course,
Right.
nor are they very interested in issues of health.
Mm-hmm.
In an ideal world, Carrie, the doctor would be an expert in nutrition and nutrients and the
Mm-hmm.
microbiome,
Yeah.
not in doing lap band or gastric bypass or
Mm-hmm.
dispensing Wegovy.
Yeah.
So healthcare is a business, and unfortunately, it means most doctors don't get involved in health. That sounds crazy, I know, but that's just the reality of the world.
Yeah.
So people have to take charge of their own health on their own,
Mm-hmm.
listening to people like you and me and others who are trying to educate them and make up for the inadequacies of the healthcare system.
Well, we know that is kind of the current prevailing system as far as, is like paying for surgeries and the endless long-term medications. But what would you say in that sort of initial guidance for people trying to eliminate SIBO? They realize they have it. What are some of the key steps in transforming the microbiome to a healthy state? To getting the bad bacteria back to where they belong in the colon or not having
Well,
them.
if you think you have it, and so telltale, what I call telltale signs. If you see fat droplets in the toilet after a bowel movement, fat
Mm,
malabsorption, that's a very good sign. If you have any food intolerance, whether it's
mm,
FODMAPs or histamine-containing foods or
mhm,
nightshades or nuts or legumes or fructose, all those things that people say, I can only eat these 5 foods,
mhm. High
have really
reactivity,
bad
yes.
SIBO. There are
Hmm.
also conditions virtually synonymous with
Hmm.
SIBO, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune diseases, neurodegenerative disorders, sleep apnea, irritable bowel syndrome, a long list of conditions. If you have those conditions, highly likely. Now, if the solution was something really awful, let's say surgical removal of your small intestine. Well,
Right.
you want to be damn certain you really need to do that, right?
Yeah.
What if the solution is
Hmm.
something that looks and smells like yogurt
Hmm.
that you make in your kitchen? So
Hmm.
I arrived at this strategy by asking this question. If you have SIBO, 30 feet of fecal
Hmm.
microbes out of
Right.
control and causing high blood pressure, heart disease, dementia, anxiety, depression, etc. What if you just took a commercial probiotic?
Hmm.
Will it go away? No, that's quite well established. You
Hmm.
might have a reduction in bloating, but you'll still
Right.
have 30 feet of fecal microbes.
Hmm.
So I asked these questions. What if we specifically chose microbes that are known to colonize the small intestine, where SIBO occurs?
Hmm.
And what if we chose microbes that are known to produce what are called bacteriocins,
Hmm.
natural antibiotics,
Hmm.
effective in killing fecal microbes? So I chose 3.
Hmm.
I chose a strain of Lactobacillus reuteri,
Hmm.
a strain of Lactobacillus gasseri, and a strain of Bacillus coagulans. These are widely
Okay.
available.
Hmm.
I fermented them
Mm-hmm.
into something that looks and smells like yogurt, but I ferment them for 36 hours because I want very high counts. And
Mm-hmm.
I subjected the yogurt to something called flow cytometry. It's a laser
Mm-hmm.
assisted counting method for microbes. And
Mm-hmm.
we're getting around 300 billion
It's amazing. I
per
know.
half cup serving.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I did this in the hopes it might help people feel a little better. To my great surprise, so far, I have about 50 people who've done this. 90% test negative for SIBO, that is negative hydrogen gas with the air device. Now,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't mean you need the air device. The air device is very nice, very like it, but you don't need it,
Right.
especially if the solution. Now, here's another twist. So we consume that, what I call SIBO yogurt, those three
Right.
microbes,
Right.
for 4 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and you have all kinds of great effects in the majority of people. But you also get, when you talk about drugs, you have to talk about side effects, sometimes
Sure.
very serious side effects,
Mm-hmm.
liver failure, gaining weight, high blood sugar. We talk about side benefits. What
Mm-hmm.
happens when you get those three microbes? The rhodori and the gasseri in particular are microbes you should have had all along from your mom at birth, but
Mm-hmm.
we've lost it. Almost nobody has. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, rhodori, almost nobody has it anymore. We've all
Mm-hmm.
lost it. So what we're really doing is restoring lost microbes.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when you restore those microbes beyond getting rid of SIBO?
Mm-hmm.
Well, ladies love it because they lose their skin wrinkles, because there's an explosion in dermal collagen.
Mm-hmm.
Guys love it because you have a return of youthful muscle and strength.
Right.
Older guys get about a 50% rise in testosterone. Older ladies will have a restoration of vaginal moisture and libido.
Mm-hmm.
There is a preservation of bone density. There's an amplification of the immune response. And a lot of these effects are mediated by the hormone oxytocin.
Mm-hmm.
Rotary sends a signal to your brain to release more oxytocin, and that increases the intensity of love and affection for people close to you. It increases your sense of generosity.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite, it increases your acceptance of other people's opinions, even if they're different from yours.
Yeah, that's so
So,
necessary in this time, just that alone.
Gary, think about that. So we've lost rotary in particular,
Mm-hmm.
thereby lost the ability to boost oxytocin, the hormone of love and empathy, at
Mm-hmm.
a time of record social isolation, suicide,
Mm-hmm.
and the rise of narcissistic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know until I started digging that the psychology community has been measuring
Mm-hmm.
measures of
Tracking.
narcissistic behavior since 1963.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a sharp incline,
Uptick. Mm-hmm.
about a 45% incline
Mm-hmm.
when you graph it, of narcissistic behavior since 1963. Well,
Mm-hmm.
could restoration of rotary and thereby provocation of oxytocin release, could that be at least part of the solution for a lot of social ills like that? I
Mm-hmm.
think it is, because I see it being played out.
Right, because it also is related with our sense of empathy, right? Being able to feel empathy for others.
Yes.
That's
And you'll
part of that,
see
the
that.
opposite spectrum. Mm-hmm.
One downside, Carrie, one downside, you'll cry more readily at movies.
You'll be more sensitive, right, to the things that matter. We're going to take a break shortly, Bill, but maybe we'll do a little rewind because I want listeners to understand your background a little bit, how they may go back to the prior episode or have heard it before, but to know what compelled you to write Supergut and really engage the healing of the microbiome.
The original books, Wheat Belly, etc., were based on my experience, some of my published evidence that saturated fat, total fat cholesterol has nothing to do with heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
The real tragedy of focusing on saturated fat and cholesterol and statin cholesterol drugs is that it took everybody's attention off the real cause. So I paid attention going back 30 some years to
Mm-hmm.
identifying and correcting the real causes of heart disease. And one of the biggest causes is the consumption of modern wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we're told cut our fat, eat more healthy whole grains, that's a formula for causing heart disease.
Right.
But I saw people do this, get rid of wheat, grains, and sugars in their diet,
Mm-hmm.
address a handful of nutrient deficiencies unique to
Mm-hmm.
modern people.
Right.
And I saw wonderful things. Weight loss, type 2 diabetics became non-diabetic, a lot of autoimmune disease went away, skin rashes receded, etc. But I also saw that some people were left with some residual problem. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
someone would say, I had rheumatoid arthritis.
Right.
I was on a biologic agent that cost me $4,000 a month in copay,
Mm-hmm.
and naproxen and prednisone. And I gained 48 pounds on the drugs. I did your program. I got off the prednisone. I got off
Mm-hmm.
the biologic, saved a ton of money, but I still have occasional flares. So I want to know why. What's missing? And that's when I looked into the microbiome. It became clear that was where the answer was. And addressing the microbiome led to, in many, many people, complete relief from whatever residual problem there was. But it also led to all these wonderful other effects, like those effects I talked about with rotary, which, Carrie, think about it. Smoother skin, youthful muscle, strength,
Preserving bone
libido,
density. Yeah.
testosterone. We're turning the clock back 10 or 20 years, and you see it on people's faces. Their faces are smoother, their shoulders are more muscular,
Right.
your walk is more confident.
We'll talk more about the benefits of healing our gut microbiome in just a moment, and we'll take a break here and be right back with you, listeners.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. We air every Thursday at 4 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles and Sunday at 4 p.m. on KPFT Houston. Stay connected by subscribing to Eco Justice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to Supergut, Healing Our Gut Microbiomes for Inner and Outer Health, with host Carrie Kim and guest Dr. William Davis, cardiologist and author of the books Wheat Belly, Undoctored, and Supergut.
So, Bill, you've had this migration then, or actually a natural evolution from the books, the Wheat Belly book series and everything you had learned there about the elimination of wheat into the gut microbiome, knowing that there was kind of a plateau that some of your patients or clients would hit and they couldn't go further. And then you realized it was really the key was in the gut microbiome and restoring these beneficial bacteria. So I'm wondering, could you first define what to you is a healthy microbiome?
Sadly, it's a work in progress. We call that eubiosis as compared to dysbiosis, but nobody really knows. So one big question is, so the modern microbiome, gastrointestinal microbiome, is very different if we look at indigenous populations, people who've not been exposed to antibiotics and glyphosate and all those things. And even though those people who might live in the Brazilian rainforest or the savannas of East Africa or the jungles of New Guinea, they all have microbiomes very similar to each other, almost identical. So the presumption is they have so-called Stone Age microbiomes, untouched by modern factors. And they have completely different composition. They have numerous species we don't have. We have species they don't have.
Whether are they good or bad? I don't know. Yeah.
They have many more species than we do. So we've lost, one of the things we've lost is diversity, that is the number of species that are present. So should we mimic that? Probably not, but there might be some lessons to take, because that their microbiome might be unique to that environment, as living in a jungle, for instance. And perhaps part of our microbiome may be adaptive to our modern life, but it's clear we've done a lot of damage in losing. And among those lost, of course, are Lactobacillus rhodori and gasseri.
These keystone species. Well, would you say that there's actually a clear delineation of the diversity, like seeing an actual specific decline in that diversity? I mean, I don't know how many species are found now in common modern person's gut flora versus, the ancient indigenous populations. Are we looking at what kind of contrast are we looking at?
Several hundred species have been lost.
Several hundred species, yeah. And that's just what we know about, right, Bill?
Right.
Because what do we know that we don't know as far as what formerly existed that's no longer here? We discussed that last time. Like, how do we trace what we don't even know we ever had?
Right. And are they really not? So one peculiar oddity about these indigenous microbiomes is the many so-called spirochete species. There's the only common spirochete in Western populations like us is the one that causes syphilis.
Well, what would you say about, we have created incredibly sterile environments, whereas indigenous populations, of course, is much more connected to nature and the natural virome, the natural microbiome. They're in it, they're touching the dirt, they're growing touching the soil, growing their foods. I mean, what of that sterility factor that is really the modern lifestyle for many people?
Yeah, that's on the list. The way we use cleaning agents and soaps and shampoos. So that's part of. We've also disrupted other. So there's more than the gastrointestinal microbiome. There's of course skin. There's an airway microbiome. There's a vaginal, of course. There's a prostate microbiome. There's a urinary bladder microbiome. There's probably a brain microbiome too.
Yeah.
These are yielding all kinds of unexpected insights, both in causing disease as well as sustaining health. For instance, it's become clear that a major cause of colon cancer is a microbe called Fusobacterium nucleatum that's in everybody's mouth. It overproliferates in people who have bleeding gums or gingivitis or periodontitis. And then remarkably, when you have any kind of oral microtrauma, like brushing your teeth or flossing, that fusobacterium enters the bloodstream and colonizes your colon, where the evidence is quite strong. It's a major cause of colon cancer. So colon cancer risk begins in the mouth. What are they doing? Looking for polyps? Well, that may be productive too, but they should be looking in the mouth. So all these insights, the microbiome, one of the most important microbes for ladies is Lactobacillus crispatus. It's the dominant microbiome in the vaginal microbiome. And if a woman lacks it, because she took antibiotics or other reasons, she's more likely as a childbearing woman at that age, she's more likely to have miscarriage. She's more likely to have premature delivery, which is catastrophic, can be. And it increases the likelihood that you have vaginal infections like vaginal candidiasis, candidal infections, or E. coli infections. It increases the frequency of urinary tract infections and urgent incontinence, cough, laugh, and you wet yourself. So restore crispatus, and all those things recede. I'm seeing it play out. And you know what? If you make yogurt with it, it's the most delicious yogurt you ever had.
Well, you've said that some of them are conducive to making these quote unquote yogurts, but some are not as conducive. And why is that?
Well, of course, yogurt is just fermentation of dairy, and not all microbes can be fermented that way. So some die upon exposure to air, for instance, like very popular one is Akkermansia muciniphila. There's a commercial product, but what they had to do to keep it alive is spray it with a polysaccharide coating. Once it's exposed to air, it dies. But most lactobacillus species, most bifidobacteria species do very well in yogurt. There are some yogurts or some microbes also produce some odd effects. One of my favorites, for instance, is Bacillus subtilis. It's a soil microbe, but it's also in your GI tract too. Some people know it as the microbe that makes natto. But Bacillus subtilis, it makes too much carbon dioxide. So I like using it in juices. You add a capsule, say, of this to juices, and it ferments the juice into a sparkling soda. So if you're going to ferment, for instance, let's say strawberry lemonade, it can't have preservatives, by the way. It can't have any potassium sorbate or sodium benzoate. But you empty your source of microbe into that juice, cap it, and about 48, 60 hours later, you have this delicious sparkling juice filled with this microbe. And that microbe, like Rhodorhine gasseri, is very good at killing fecal microbes, including in the small intestine, not just colon.
So how are people actually discerning what microbes they may be lacking? Because I know that's kind of where we're kind of just throwing things against the wall, right? Just taking this and that microbe or taking these various different strains. But how do we really know what are the things we are lacking based on what our conditions are? Because
the legacy of antibiotics is this. If you have this kind of infection, take this antibiotic. If you have pneumococcal pneumonia, take that antibiotic. If you have a staphylococcal skin infection, take that antibiotic. So we need to get away from that kind of thinking. One of the great things about the microbiome, we did talk about some specific microbes, but for the most part, people don't have to worry about that. That is the key. The most important thing people can do is get fermented foods, just like your great grandma did, but modern people have abandoned. So when you ferment foods, it could be sauerkraut, could be kimchi, could be fermented pickles, it could be fermented meats, kefir, yogurts. But what's so interesting, Carrie, these microbes in fermented foods, these are species like Leuconostoc mesenteroides, Pediococcus pentasaceus, or Weisella species. Well, these microbes in the fermented food don't take up residence for the most part in the GI tract. They go in, and you poop them out. So what good are they?
Right.
They're great at cultivating all those species where we tend to lack. It's not quite clear how, because you can't just make a bacteria.
Right.
But somehow consumption of fermented foods allows the appearance and proliferation of beneficial microbes. These are microbes like Fecalibacterium, Akkermansia, Ruminicaceae, and all those lactobacillus and bifidobacteria species. So you don't have to get each and every species. Fermented foods are the cornerstone. Now, we do add those keystone species because the effects are so big. Want to be sure you get those species.
Right.
Those just a handful of those species. The vast majority can be restored simply by embracing this idea of consuming fermented foods.
But is it important to have a few of these keystone species, just like in the ecosystem? I mean, it's important to have a keystone species of plants or trees for the entire ecosystem to flourish. And I'm sure that's probably true as well for the microbes.
It's an ongoing debate. Which of these species should we call keystone species? I would say Rhodori is on that list. I would say Lactobacillus gasseri is on that list. I think Bacillus subtilis is on that list. Fecalibacterium and Akkermansia are on that list, but those you typically can't really get from food, fermented food, or from probiotics because they die upon exposure to air. So they're a keystone, but they're ones you cultivate. You can't really take them. And there's probably many others. There may be some Prevotella species. There may be some Clostridium species. That's really interesting because Clostridium people recognize as, say, Clostridium difficile, which makes you very sick after an antibiotic, or Clostridium butyricum. I'm sorry, Clostridium botulinum causes botulism. Clostridium perfringens causes gas gangrene in soldiers who are injured in war. So people are afraid of Clostridium. But there are beneficial Clostridia too, like Clostridium butyricum, a major producer of the fatty acid butyrate that mediates many of the wonderful effects of microbes. So there's an ongoing debate on what microbes we should label as keystone, which are not so important. So it's an ongoing debate, Carrie.
Right. I'm sure that's just like anything, right? But it does seem that the key is in the diversity, though, period. Just like in the ecosystem, when we're planting, we want to have that diversity of species because everything thrives more in diversity. That's just the way of nature. So it makes sense that we want to just continue just spreading out the diversity, taking different strains and ensuring that you're constantly fulfilling the needs of the microbiome.
Absolutely. It makes me think of the ocean. You know, if we see declining populations of plankton, these little tiny creatures, well, the whales and jellyfish will start to disappear because they're filter feeding creatures that rely on plankton. So that illustrates the power, the importance of keystone species. So there's no question we need key. That's why we do these specific yogurts like Rhodori and Gasseri to make sure we get those keystone species.
Just like you've talked about the extensive amount of benefits from just Rhodori alone, and maybe not all of them have that same kind of impact on our physical health.
You know, Carrie, Rhodori was the first microbe I chose to play with. And by sheer dumb luck, I believe I chose the most interesting, the most important microbe. Not to say there aren't other very interesting microbes, but Rhodori is endlessly interesting.
If you could speak a little about the back history of Rhodori and the discovery of it, because it's very interesting to track when the German microbiologist Reuter found it and then when it started disappearing, because it seems to really track along the lines of, you know, the influence of glyphosate and processed foods, and you could kind of just from what 1962 to 2000, right?
Exactly. So Dr. Gerhard Reuter, a microbiologist, an academic microbiologist working in Germany, isolated this microbe for the first time from a woman's breast milk in 1962. And it was ubiquitous. You could find it in stool, you could find it in breast milk, it was everywhere. And it was also, by the way, readily found in other mammals, readily found in indigenous populations. Over his 40-year academic career, he started to notice he couldn't find it anymore. And towards the end of his career, it was almost gone entirely. And that has since been corroborated by several other studies where almost everybody has lost Lactobacillus rhodori, among other species also. But it's become rare now. About 4% of modern people have rhodori anymore. But those are the people, the 96% who restore rhodori have these spectacular effects that I would say are tantamount to youth preserving or age reversing
Mm-hmm.
effects.
Mm-hmm. And is it still the same with animals as well? As animals in the wild are no longer also having the rotary, or is that still in that similar kind of percentage?
No, the rule is that wild mammals, whether it's a gopher or a raccoon or a deer or a moose, they all have rotary.
Mm-hmm.
If we went to the indigenous populations in the jungles of New Guinea, for instance, they all have rotary at high level. And by the way, they also have very high levels of oxytocin.
Mm-hmm.
Our levels are less than half
Mm-hmm.
as much. And here's an interesting idea, because I was thinking about doing a clinical study, but probably not in this one. But there's now 5 studies that looked at the oxytocin levels in cerebrospinal fluid, blood, or saliva in people who attempt suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And people who attempt suicide have about 50% lower levels of oxytocin.
Mm-hmm.
So could restoration of rotary and thereby oxytocin, could that be a means to reduce
Mm-hmm.
the frequency or the likelihood of suicide? We don't know. It's a tough study to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe, knowing what we do about rotary and oxytocin, that probably is at least a partial solution.
Sure. Well, it makes sense that you find indigenous populations that are more communally living as well, and how they could live in those kinds of societies. It's sort of like natural adaptive evolution, right? That's what we
Of
need.
course, we don't want to overstate this because, humans have been rotten humans all throughout human history.
Sure.
Only
Not to
recently.
romanticize, but compared with modern living, definitely they live more communally, you know. Could you speak a bit more about your work with Realize Therapeutics? I know you're working with some of the innovative solutions being used to heal the disrupted gut microbiome, and I don't know what sorts of things are coming out of there.
Well, so I talk about these things like we are today,
Mm-hmm.
and I tell ladies about these things, and they say, you know what? I don't care so much about muscle or the immune response
Mm-hmm.
or bone density. I just want better skin.
Mm.
And I thought, what? All right, fine. So I did a small human clinical trial in ladies to look at their skin effects. So we did something called high resolution skin ultrasound to measure the thickness of the dermis. So you see, of course, the epidermis on the exterior, but it's the dermal layer just beneath that is the primary determinant of your skin health and appearance.
Mm-hmm.
So we measured it using high resolution skin ultrasound, and we did indeed, in this case, we did restoration of rotary, and to stack the odds in favor of favorable skin responses, I threw in collagen peptides,
Mm-hmm.
hyaluronic acid, 2 things, by the way, lacking in modern diets because we've been told to cut our cholesterol and fat. So most modern people have abandoned consumption of organ meats, but that's where people got collagen and hyaluronic acid.
Mm-hmm.
And then I threw in the carotenoid astaxanthin
Mm-hmm.
because most people eat too much processed and ultra processed foods that is devoid of carotenoids. And carotenoids have wonderful effects on skin and other parts of your health.
Mm-hmm.
So those 4 things, we measured their skin baseline in 90 days, and there was a marked increase in dermal thickness, more than ever seen before by any method. But even more interestingly, so this was a skin study,
Right.
but we happened to measure their waist circumference. And to my great surprise, they lost a huge amount of abdominal fat. I did not expect that,
Right.
but didn't lose much weight.
Mm-hmm.
Presumptively, an increase in muscle. So I think what I did by doing this little skin trial,
Right.
I stumbled inadvertently on a way to change shape and body composition, shrink abdominal fat, restore youthful muscle. And we're seeing that. I personally had that when I first started doing this in my 60s, many years ago.
Right.
I'm 67.
Yeah.
I gained 13 pounds of muscle over 3
Amazing.
weeks.
Wow.
And my strength increased by 50%. In my 60s, Carrie, I was handling weights that I used to handle in my 20s. And I don't know about you, I hate going to the gym. I go 15 minutes once a week, if at all. And yet I gained all that muscle and strength. So I think I've stumbled on a new, now contrast this, what happens with GLP-1 agonist drugs like Wegovy, Ozempic, and Mounjaro, where your patient or your friend pays $12,000, for instance, for a year's worth of Wegovy, say, loses 40 pounds, of which 10 pounds is muscle, and muscle is the principal determinant of metabolic rate, the rate at which you burn calories.
Right.
So that person stops the drug because few people can afford that forever.
Sure.
They regain 32 to 34 pounds as fat,
Mm-hmm.
and they're more prone to type 2 diabetes, heart
Than they ever
disease,
were before.
dementia, yes, than they were
Yeah,
before.
exact opposite
And,
effect of what
and they look 10 to 20 years older now, this
Mhm.
so-called Ozempic face. So I think I may have stumbled on a way to lose abdominal fat, the most problematic source of kind
Mhm.
of,
Right.
and return youthful muscle. And we're
Mhm.
seeing this play out in humans.
It's amazing. So, Bill, we're going to take a break back here. Right now, and then we'll be right back, listeners, to talk more about Supergut and how to increase our gut health.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying Eco Justice Radio. We air every Thursday at 4 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles and Sunday at 4 p.m. on KPFT Houston. Stay connected by subscribing to Eco Justice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today you are listening to Supergut, Healing Our Gut Microbiomes for Inner and Outer Health, with host Carrie Kim and guest Dr. William Davis, cardiologist and author of the books Wheat Belly, Undoctored, and Supergut.
So, Bill, we're back, listeners, with Bill Davis, Dr. William Davis, author of Supergut. And I wanted to redirect a little bit into glyphosate. And we've covered the harmful impacts of glyphosate on the show many times. The key ingredient in the herbicide Roundup and the broad spectrum herbicide created by Monsanto, now Bayer. I wonder if you could review how glyphosate disturbs and disrupts our microbiome.
Well, when Monsanto filed its original patents for glyphosate many years ago, they filed it as an herbicide, of course, but they also filed patents for glyphosate as an antibiotic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very potent antibiotic, but ironically, it's very effective in killing beneficial microbes like lactobacillus species or Faecalibacterium. And it's ineffective in killing fecal microbes. We call them proteobacteria.
Right.
These are E. coli and Salmonella, Citrobacter, Campylobacter, Pseudomonas, all the pathogens. So glyphosate selects for fecal microbe overproliferation, killing off good, not killing off bad. Now, no one's done that study, of course, in humans.
Right.
If I said, hey, we're going to take 100 people and give them glyphosate,
Right. Nobody would want to, hopefully. But, you had also mentioned the bacteria Lactobacillus plantarum and some of its potentiality to maybe consume glyphosate, although it was inconclusive whether there was any meaningful effect from that. But I wonder if there's been any other further findings on microbes that might help digest glyphosate to support our health, because we know it is so widespread. It's in breast milk, it's in the air, soil, water. It comes down in the form of rain. If you could explain what are any new discoveries with that?
What's becoming clear, Carrie, is that there are multiple species, plantarum and otherwise, that consume toxins. It could be lead, could be cadmium, could be glyphosate. What's not clear yet is, does that yield meaningful reductions in a living human? So that's not yet been done. I'm hopeful it will, because some of the preliminary evidence, for instance, that some species can reduce cadmium. Cadmium is a problem because it accumulates, because it's where you're exposed, say, by shellfish.
Right.
The clams you had 30 years ago
Not the
that
same.
gave you cadmium, that cadmium is still in your body. So if we can get microbe to bind the cadmium and you pass it out in the toilet. But so far, so in animals, it's a dramatic effect, but it's not yet been done in humans. So I'm hoping that, and this, by the way, parallels in such diseases as gout or hyperuricemia. That evidence is good. There are about 5 microbes that reduce uric acid quite dramatically. There's microbes that reduce oxalate that would have led to calcium oxalate kidney stones. But we still don't have ample data on the toxic compounds. It's going to come out in the next few years, though.
Where are some of the places that someone could resource what the different bacteria do, as you're illustrating? I mean, so many of the strains, but is there some place that people could reliably go to learn some of the benefits of different microbes?
Well, my books, of course. So,
Right. Besides your,
book.
your books definitely cover a lot of them, but
And in the book and in my website, the
Mhm.
WilliamDavisMD.com or drdavisinfinitehealth.com, either one,
Mhm.
I do this. I say things like this. If you want better skin, get Lactobacillus rhodori. If you want to shrink your waist, get Lactobacillus gasseri and some other things. If you
Mhm.
want a healthier baby, make
Mhm.
sure it's getting Bifidobacterium infantis.
Mhm.
If you want faster recovery from strenuous exercise, because maybe you're an athlete and you want to
Mhm.
be in tip-top shape every time you're competing, get Bacillus coagulans
Mhm.
because it reduces muscle injury incurred during strenuous exercise.
Mhm.
If you're a woman and you do want to reduce your risk of miscarriage or premature delivery, get Lactobacillus crispatus. Or if you're a woman with having repeated urinary tract infections or urgent incontinence, get Lactobacillus crispatus. So you can do that. You can get a microbe for specific effects,
Mhm.
but you also never want to neglect your fermented foods because they help sustain the microbes.
Mhm. Could you talk a little bit at this point between prebiotics and postbiotics and the benefits of both, or if you think both are necessary?
So prebiotics, of course, or the broader terms, awkward term, microbiota accessible carbohydrates or MACs.
Okay.
Because as you know, there's been a lot of debate about what
Right.
is prebiotic fiber, what's a resistant starch, what's a polysaccharide. So I tell
Okay.
people, don't worry about that stuff.
Mhm.
Just know what microbes like to eat. They
Right.
like
And
to
feed
eat
them.
fibers,
Mhm.
not cellulose or bran fiber. These are fibers like inulin or fructooligosaccharides in such
Acacia.
things as onions or shallots, or
Mhm.
the galacto-oligosaccharides in legumes and
Mhm.
vegetables.
Mhm.
So we need those fibers nourish microbes. So
Mhm.
inulin FOS, for instance, fructooligosaccharides,
Mhm.
help bloom those really important species like
Mhm.
Fecalibacterium. Fecalibacterium is the principal producer of butyrate, butyric acid in your GI
Mhm.
tract. So
Mhm.
getting that inulin FOS fiber is really, really important.
Mhm. Mhm.
So-called postbiotics are products. There's some metabolite or something shed or produced by microbes. Now
Mhm.
they've gained, I think, more than they deserve in popularity
Mhm.
because that's where the pharmaceutical industry has tried to get involved because
Oh.
they want patent protection, and you really can't
Mm.
patent. It's hard to patent microbes.
Uh-huh.
So if I like
Thankfully.
carrie, I can't patent carrie, right? You're a living creature.
Yeah.
It's hard to patent living creatures, but you
Thankfully.
can
Mm.
patent a metabolite or a product. And
Mhm.
so farmers gotten a lot involved with that.
Mhm.
Some other money-making type ventures have gotten
Right.
involved in the postbiotics. There's going to be some good to come out of it.
Right.
Postbiotics have become very popular, for instance, or growing popularity for
Mhm.
skin applications
Mhm.
because it's
Mhm.
hard to apply living microbes in, say, a cream. So
Mhm.
they isolate, say, a protein or other compound and
Mhm.
put that in the product, and that's becoming popular. I
Right.
still think it's living microbes that really pack the punch, though.
Sure, of course. What would you tell people as far as taking the first steps to healing and restoring their microbiome? What would you recommend? Definitely
Karen, I tell
eat.
people, because this becomes overwhelming for some, right?
Right.
It's so different from what your
Mhm.
doctor's telling you for the most part.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
tell people, think of it just like your backyard garden in springtime. I don't know if you have springtime in Hawaii, but or LA, but uh,
Yeah.
in northern climates, if you're going to have a springtime garden, you lay out maybe a 10 by 10 plot. You pick out the sticks and stones. So you prepare the soil. Then you
Mhm.
plant seeds,
Mhm.
and then you water and fertilize
Right.
throughout the growing season. So the microbiome is just the same way.
Mhm.
We prepare the soil, not dirt, of course, not sticks and stones,
Right.
but things like filter your water from chlorine.
Mhm.
Avoid foods that have glyphosate or other herbicides and pesticides. Don't eat
Right.
processed foods that contain preservatives or
Mhm.
emulsifying agents.
Emulsifying
Minimize
agent.
your need for antibiotics. Always question the need for antibiotics. There's a long list of these things. It's all in the
Mhm.
Supergut book. It's in my website. And it's pretty common sense stuff. A lot of it involves this return to whole foods that are organic.
Mhm. Mhm.
Then we plant seeds. And the
Right.
most important seeds are the fermented foods
Mhm.
and some of those keystone species.
Mhm.
And then we water and fertilize it. That's the role of prebiotic fibers and related compounds. That's
Mhm.
the inulin FOS, the galacto-oligosaccharides and legumes, jicama, dandelion greens, leeks, black beans, white, all those kinds of plant foods. By the way, there's one very important fiber
Mhm. Okay.
That doesn't come from plants. Almost all fibers come from plants.
Mm-hmm.
But hyaluronic acid is also a fiber. We don't think of it that way.
Wow. Yeah, I wouldn't think that. Yep.
But it's a fiber. Of course, it's used as filler for injections to reduce wrinkles. It's used as cushioning in joints with arthritis. But and a lot of ladies know about hyaluronic acid. They say, "Oh, I know all about hyaluronic acid. I put it as a serum around my eyes." Well, the real power of hyaluronic acid is ingested orally. It increases dermal collagen, increases dermal moisture. It increases the lubricating synovial fluid in your joints. The uterus, cervix, and vagina is mostly hyaluronic acid. So it's useful there. It's useful for eye health. We need better evidence. It's probably useful for arterial health and protection from atherosclerosis because the so-called glycocalyx, that's the signaling polysaccharides that line your arteries, is made of hyaluronic acid. But the other really interesting aspect of hyaluronic acid is that you ingest it orally and it acts as a fiber on your gastrointestinal microbiome. And it causes a bloom in Faecalibacterium, Akkermansia, Bacterospiraceae. I mean, all those beneficial microbes, and it suppresses fecal microbes and reduces that endotoxemia. So hyaluronic acid, absent in most diets of modern people, because they're doing things like buying boneless, skinless chicken breast. They throw away the hyaluronic acid.
Right.
And it's such an important fiber, but it's one of the few fibers that comes from animals.
That's amazing. Well, the whole foods piece is critical to get back to. We have fragmented things so much and specialized things so much, and that's really what we need to get back to is the whole foods, but not the healthy whole grains. We had a whole conversation on that. So if you could talk about reimplanting the microbes, just so that people understand it's not that you can just assume that they will magically appear. I mean, we've talked about prebiotics and nurturing the environment in which they grow, eating fermented foods. But at the same time, you had discussed that normally a person ideally would have received their beneficial gut microbiomes, their initial gut microbiome health from their mothers if they were birthed vaginally. And that's not the case for many people these days. And even the mothers these days won't even have the beneficial microbes to pass on. But you've said that when that has happened, there's a greater longevity for those microbes to remain for a longer term, even though microbes, as you've said, they live only a short time, like several hours, perhaps. So why is it that when it's transferred to us that way, vaginally, we have longer longevity of that microbiome health versus if you are taking it exogenously?
A fundamental question for which there's no answer.
It's a mystery, life's mysteries.
You're exactly right. If your mom gave you Lactobacillus reuteri, for instance, at birth, by passing through the birth canal or breastfeeding or contact, you'd have that microbe for the rest of your life, barring exposure to antibiotics and glyphosate. All
that would kill it off.
But let's say you did lose it because you took amoxicillin 20 years ago for an upper respiratory infection or a urinary tract infection. You lost reuteri. We restore reuteri, maybe with the reuteri yogurt, and it takes up residence maybe for a couple of weeks at most. Well, why? Well, presumptively, there's not proof. This is just a suspicion. It's because microbes are just like people. We don't live in isolation. We have partners, families, neighbors, co-workers, communities. Microbes are just the same. They have groups. We say guild or consortia. And it's probably that we're not restoring reuteri in its community, in its consortium of collaborative microbes. So I think in future, what we'll probably say is rather than say something like make Lactobacillus reuteri yogurt, we're going to say cultivate reuteri with these 5 other species or whatever. And that will allow you maybe make the yogurt with those 5 species and do it on for a week or so, and then it's with you for the rest of your life. But no one's figured that out yet.
Right. It's just like companion planting, right, Bill? Or how trees want to live in a guild, a community, because that's where they get the synergistic support. I know you mentioned some of the synergistic combos like the reuteri, the gaceri, and the coagulants. I don't know if there's any other specific synergistic combos that you highly recommend. I know there's probably more in Supergut, but
right now, given limited knowledge, it's what, for instance, like the uric acid, the hyperuricemia.
Mhm.
There are several microbes, because they reduce uric acid by different mechanisms.
Mhm.
You get this wonderful synergy when you combine two or three microbes, more
Mhm.
powerful than the drugs for reducing uric acid. So that's
Mhm.
one example. I think there's going to be probably this is going to be true in the vaginal microbiome, where
Mhm.
yes, Crispus is very important, but there's probably
Right.
some others,
Mhm.
maybe Lactobacillus jensenii or Lactobacillus ense, and there's
Mhm.
some others. So this is all likewise a work in progress. The
Yeah, it's
collaborative effects;
evolving.
those require some very complex investigation.
It's an infinite world when we get into the microbial
It
world.
is.
Yeah.
It really is.
I wondered, I think it's necessary to discuss what the impact of the pandemic has been upon people's digestive tracts. I know that many people suffered adverse effects to their capacity to digest. Maybe they had a lot of bloating and inflammation. And I wonder if you could speak about that and the benefits of building their gut microbiome, especially given the impact of vaccines, just the schedule of children, their vaccines. They have an infinite number of vaccines that they are taking from a very early age, disrupting their immune health and their microbiome health. If you might comment on that.
Well, the evidence tells us there's not a whole lot of evidence, there's only some, but the evidence tells us that there may be a specific depletion of
Mm-hmm.
bifidobacteria species
Mm-hmm.
after COVID exposure. And
Okay.
that leaves a lot of people with all those symptoms, bloating, diarrhea, et
Oh,
cetera.
yes, diarrhea too. Mm-hmm.
Well, thankfully, bifidobacteria you can get easily as probiotics, but even better. So one of the reasons to ferment these foods, these
Yes.
microbes as
Mm-hmm.
foods, whether it's
Yeah.
yogurt, and by the way, it doesn't have to be dairy, it could be coconut milk. It
Right.
could, I have fermenting in my kitchen right now. I have salsa fermenting. I have mango passion fruit juice.
We're going to
I've
your
got,
house. No. Yeah.
I've got tomatoes,
Mhm.
onions, Japanese eggplant. I have all kinds of things being fermented. So it doesn't have to be yogurt. Yogurt just happens
Right.
to be a very forgiving,
Sure.
easy way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you can get those bifidobacteria species as probiotics. You can
Mm-hmm.
take that as a probiotic, but typically, when a retailer or manufacturer sells you a probiotic, they
Right.
have to buy it from a manufacturer themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
microbes tend to be very expensive.
Right.
Uh, and so when you buy a commercial probiotic, typically it has low bacterial counts, 2 billion,
Mm-hmm.
5 billion, 10 billion, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in the world of microbes, the more microbes, the bigger the beneficial effect. So
Mm-hmm.
when we make the yogurt, let's say you're going to ferment Bifidobacterial longum,
Right.
and you buy it as a 2 billion count capsule.
Huh. Mm-hmm.
Well, you ferment it. Now you got something like 300 billion.
Right.
So you have a much bigger effect. So that's the advantage of fermentation. You amplify, and fermentation is
Exponentially.
very low cost and very easy. Some people are scared by it, but it's very easy once you get the hang of
Mm-hmm.
it. I really have
Mm-hmm.
a dozen fermenting
Yeah.
in my kitchen counter right
Right.
now.
Yeah, and you give a lot of explicit instructions on how to do that in your books and on your website. That's a lot of information
And
there.
if our great grandmothers were here, they'd slap us and say, "Well, why aren't you eating fermented foods?" So
Yeah,
it's an old practice that needs to be resurrected.
exactly. I mean, a lot of people do know about it, but there's a huge amount of populace that doesn't still. Could you talk about the benefits of soil-based organisms as probiotics? I mean, when we talk about ecosystem health, and we know that there's been incredible decimation of microbes and beneficial microbes in our soil, given modern industrial farming practices and industrial ag. If you could talk about soil-based organisms and your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so there are some very important ones that I'd rank up there as keystone species also. So Bacillus coagulans is
Mm-hmm.
one spore form. It's very, very important. That's the one that preserves your muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, another one is Bacillus subtilis. That's the
Mm-hmm.
one that people recognize as the natto maker. But
Mm-hmm.
not all Bacillus subtilis strains make K2 or
Mm-hmm.
make natto. I don't know
Okay.
about you. I can't eat nut. My mom was
I love
Japanese.
natto myself, but I'm anyway, okay.
And some make vitamin K2.
Mm-hmm.
Bacillus subtilis is a very interesting microbe, mostly because it's so good in killing pathogenic microbes, both
Mm-hmm.
so-called gram-positive and gram-negative. So it
Mm-hmm.
kills those fecal microbes like E.
Mm-hmm.
coli and Salmonella, also kills some of the pathogenic gram-positives. These are microbes, like, of course, like Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus, and Enterococcus. So Bacillus subtilis is very important. There's some others. What's not clear is the full role. Now, a good friend of mine is Dr. Kiran Krishnan, who founded Microbiome Labs, and they are the makers of the Megaspore Biotic. So my good friend is an expert in spore-forming microbes, and he's done some studies to show that probiotics of spore formers also reduces endotoxemia. That's a really good effect.
Fantastic. Bill, we are coming to a close, and it goes by so fast because there's so much to discuss. It's such a vital topic for our times. And truly, the inner health is outer health right now. And I'm wondering, what would you most like listeners to take away about the gut microbiome?
That you got to pay attention to it. Sadly, you can't go to most primary care doctors or even gastroenterologists and say, hey, doc, I saw fat in the toilet. I think I have SIBO. And most gastroenterologists will say, no, you don't. There's nothing wrong with you. I didn't see anything on your endoscopy or colonoscopy. You don't see anything with SIBO. Or they might say something like, did you consult Dr. Google again, Carrie? Right? Or some other way. Or at most, some of them might say, well, here's a prescription for Xifaxan, the antibiotic.
Yeah, antibiotics. Okay, I know. Like you say, the overprescription of antibiotics, the wild and indiscriminate use of antibiotics for anything, even a viral infection. Totally inappropriate, right? Yeah.
If antibiotics were part of the reason that got us here, is the solution an antibiotic? So we do need better evidence that this so-called SIBO yogurt works. I'm trying to get the funding together to do a formal clinical trial. But I can tell you, the bar is so low. It's so benign. It's so easy. And what else gives you smoother skin, restoration, youthful muscle, increased your libido? In other words, I can think of no reason to not
take it. Yeah. And even though I know you just mentioned it, the SIBO yogurt, I know you've been saying it's really more reimplanting keystone species yogurt. That's really what it is.
I should have called it reimplantation of keystone microbes yogurt.
Yeah, it just rolls right off the tongue. Bill, could you share some of the links on how listeners can be connected to you, your research, all of the resources that you have available on restoring our gut health?
So I just redirected my awkwardly named drdavesinfinitehealth.com. You just put in williamdavesmd.com now. So either one will work.
Okay.
There's several thousand blog posts. There's several 100,000 forum discussions. There's also a weekly two-way Zoom like this I have with about 90 people, 100 people, something like that. And we talk about these kinds of things. And of course, the Supergut book.
Right. Listeners, definitely pick up the Supergut book, and while you're at it, also the Wheat Belly book, because all of this is essential to our health. We know it's not a guarantee having our health in these days. We actually have to promote it ourselves and be diligent about health. So thank you again for all your wonderful work in the world and the many, many people that you've helped heal their bodies and eliminate disease, Bill.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you to our guest, Dr. William Davis. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Supergut, healing our gut microbiomes for inner and outer health. For an extended version of this interview, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Ecojustice Radio, SoCal350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. Project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on KPFK, KPFT, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer, myself, Jack Eit. Producer and co-host, Jessica Aldridge. Co-host, Carrie Kim. And engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.